Most guys learning game are beginners. And that is why the question, how do I get good fast as a beginner, is such a commonly asked question and such an important one. The problem is it can't be answered without more information. You see, there are two distinct types of beginners, and the path for one is the opposite of the path for the other. So we need to first determine what type of beginner you are. And that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to decide what type of beginner are you, and based on that, what do you specifically need to do to get good fast. So the key distinction between categories of beginners is very simple. The question is, do you primarily lack game skills, i.e. skills specific to meeting women, or do you lack social skills equal or more to the amount you lack game skills? And either one is completely fine. Either guy can learn to be good with girls and to be good socially. However, the path is very different, so it's important to understand which you are. So the primary distinction between beginners comes down to a simple question. Is your issue in game primarily around women, or is it around social skills in general? See, there are some guys who are pretty good socially overall, but they're nervous or uncomfortable or inexperienced around women specifically. There's also guys who just are not good socially overall or not experienced socially in general. And there are even some guys who have actually studied game and are actually decent with women, but aren't decent at overall social skills. So you need to ask yourself, of the two, is it general socializing you need more work on, or is it women-specific stuff? Because the path will be dramatically different depending which area you lack more. So I want you to ask yourself, which type of beginner are you? So let's get a little nerdy about this in order to illustrate what I'm talking about. I want you to think of being good at game as a grid where you have 4 quadrants and 2 axes. On this axis, we'll call this is your x-axis, there is your skill in game. On your y-axis, there is your skill in general socialization. All right, and there's 4 quadrants. So up here is the quadrant you want to get to, which is good at game and good at socializing. Down here would be good at socializing and bad at game, good at game and bad at socializing, and then this would be inexperienced or bad at both. All right, and so ideally, obviously, you'd like to move in a diagonal from the quote-unquote worst quadrant to the best quadrant. The problem is the most natural way to move along this grid is in diagonals. So as you learn game, let's say you're increasing your game skill. Well, what's going to happen in practice is you're not going to go straight upward. What's going to happen actually is you're going to go up and out. Because as you're learning game, you're doing things that are a little bit polarizing. You're doing things that are a little bit uncalibrated. And especially if your core social skills aren't great to begin with, you're likely to get actually somewhat worse at socializing in learning game. And that can be problematic. Let's say that you are learning to be better at socializing. Well, in doing that, you're going to be around a lot of people, you're going to be around a lot of opinions, a lot of social pressure, that kind of stuff, and you're likely to become slightly more conformist, slightly more sort of indoctrinated into mainstream social thought, which is going to make it actually harder to do some of the ballsier moves in game, some of the quote-unquote uncalibrated or risky things that are necessary to be polarizing and do good game. So as you're socializing better, it's natural that you're in a diagonal that's kind of going downwards. As you're getting better at game, you're likely to be in a diagonal that's going slightly outwards. And so what tends to happen is as you start learning, you're getting better and your results are getting better, but then at a certain point, you're getting too far away from where you're going. And if you keep going down this path, you won't get better. You need to find the balance. And oftentimes what you've started working on or what you've gotten success with so far in your life is the opposite of what you need to keep doing to get to the promised land over here. A great example of this distinction can be seen in a recent boot camp I had. I had 3 students, and they were all beginners in terms of their results, but there were 3 very different types of beginners. I had one guy who had been popular and somewhat successful with girls in high school. I had another guy who had studied game very intensely and even knew game theory that I hadn't heard about for a decade. And then I had one guy who was actually kind of just inexperienced at both. And so these guys had very different paths towards getting good, and I'm happy to say they all made significant progress, but in very, very different ways. So the guy who was good with girls in high school is in a lot of ways for me the simplest to teach, because basically all I have to do is I have to teach him game and I have to get him to take some risks. So I had to get him to push his comfort zone, which he did resist and he did struggle with for a while, but once he started to do it and he started to see results, it became very easy. So he left the boot camp having gone from this bottom left quadrant up to actually the quadrant of being legitimately at a decent level in game. I would say he cracked intermediate and is well on his way, if he continues doing what he's doing, to advanced. And he actually probably got a little less calibrated throughout the boot camp, but he got tremendously more risky. He got tremendously more opportunities opening themselves up to him. And I'm very confident in where he's going to go going forward. The guy who had studied tons and tons of game is a little more complicated to teach, although of the people on the boot camp, he's the one I have the most faith in the long run, because he's shown the willingness to study, the willingness to learn, and the willingness to actually go out. So his post-boot camp effort and post-boot camp plan will probably be better than everybody else, and I'm very confident in him. He went from being highly uncalibrated and getting big reactions to toning down the reactions a little bit, becoming more calibrated. I wouldn't say he quite entered into that realm of being good game, but he got a lot closer to it, and his results have gotten a lot better, and he knows the path he's on, and I'm very confident he'll continue on that path. The third guy in boot camp, who was in sort of this bottom quadrant, I was extremely proud of, because he actually managed to have a diagonally upward trajectory, which is really, really hard to do, and he made tremendous progress. I was actually getting tons of phone numbers and tons of decent results by the end of the program. One thing to note with him though, he was extremely sort of state dependent and extremely warm-up dependent, because he inherently was not that socially experienced. So his first few approaches of each session were a bit rocky, but if we could get him to stick with it, which we did, and he got socially warmed up, he started to in effect be like the guy who had decent social skills, and then he just needed to learn game. And so his sort of sessions would look more like this rather than diagonal upward, but his trajectory throughout the boot camp was diagonally upward, and he again made tremendous progress. His big struggle is going to be sticking with it, because it is so hard for him to do those first few approaches, but if he sticks with it, I think he'll do very, very well as well. So all three guys got tremendous progress, all three guys got results, but what I had to teach them was dramatically different. What I was teaching the guy who was popular in high school but not so good with game was actually the opposite of what I was teaching the guy who is skilled at game, so to speak, but not so skilled socially. So right now I'm going to talk to you guys about what you can personally do in your game practice, even when you're not on boot camp with me. By all means, feel free to come on boot camp with me, but what you can do from home to work on these things as well. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you guys from either quadrant, the quadrant of being good socially but bad at game, or good at game but inexperienced socially, what specifically you need to do to get to the promised land. If you're the guy who's generally socially good but not so skilled at game, here's my prescription for you. What you need to do mostly is learn to take more risks and learn to take the smart risks in game. See, having been in a social circle, you're probably very calibrated. In fact, you're probably too calibrated for your own good. You don't take enough risk, and that's why you fit in. I recommend that you have two places to learn game. One, in your social circle, just keep doing you and maybe take some slight, tiny risks to try and become more of a leader or a little more alpha in your social circle, but these should be small, gradual adjustments, no big changes. Then I recommend you go out completely separate from your social circle and learn cold approach in a place where you do not have social consequences, in a place where a rejection will not hurt you. And there I recommend you take big risks. What's going to happen is if you take big risks over here and you realize they're okay, you're going to instinctively and naturally take some small risks in your social circle, which will make you more alpha. Don't worry about becoming slightly less calibrated. You're already probably too calibrated. You need to be more ballsy. And even if you go a little bit this direction on the way up, it's going to be a net positive. So I really recommend that. In terms of learning technique, learning canned lines is fine. Learning game the way like the system would outline it, learning game in the traditional way is absolutely perfect for you. The way that game is generally taught is designed around guys like you who are decent socially but need to specifically learn game. So you can learn game in a very prescriptive way, but you need to have the balls to take risks. If on the other hand, you're the guy who's good at the game moves but not so good at socializing in general, your path is going to look tremendously different. In this case, I really recommend you put your ego aside and, importantly, put your need to be alpha aside. You may get less alpha on your path to getting good. Within your study and practice of game, I suggest you actually really focus on connection. Focus on paying attention, getting to know the girl. Focus on doing well the thing that the chody guys do well. Because you're already doing the gamey stuff well. You're already holding your frame. You're probably clinging to your frame too tightly. It's okay to relax and let go of your frame a little bit. So focus on those later stages of the game, the connection, and don't worry if you lose a little bit of value. Compared to like value and comfort, you probably are too high on the value spectrum and too low on the comfort spectrum anyway. Beyond that, outside of game, one of the absolute best things you can do is incorporate something social into your life. Go back to school, join a dance class, join a co-ed sport, something along those lines. Get in situations where you're being social without an agenda, where you're being social without wanting anything from the other person other than enjoying the conversation. You need to genuinely learn to enjoy conversation and learn to interact without having an outcome in mind. That's where you're going to become more socially calibrated. That's where you're going to become more normal, right? You're already high value enough when you're putting on your persona, but you need to learn to act without your persona. You need to let your guard down. Don't be vulnerable per se, but do be open. Be open to the human experience, be open to getting to know someone, and let someone in. Don't be so rigid, and don't be protecting your ego or your alphaness. It's okay to let the other person win. It's okay to lose your frame a little bit and just make it fun for the other person. That's going to be a huge lesson that you need to learn. The other thing you can do, if you like, is do some actual cold approaches where you are not trying to close. You can talk to girls you're not that interested in and just try and make your goal to enjoy the conversation for its own sake rather than to seduce her. You can even go approach guys. Just start conversations with people in general without an outcome. Now, don't do this exclusively. Keep approaching hot girls, of course. That's one of the things you have going for you. But do some approaches where you don't have an outcome and some where you do. And the behaviors you're utilizing when you're just having fun and just enjoying the interaction for its own sake will bleed over into your outcome-oriented interactions and make you much more sort of palatable, calibrated, much more normal, which is what you really need to do. You need to take all that high-value frame control you have and normalize it a bit, even if you become slightly more chody along the way temporarily. If you're the guy who is socially inexperienced and game inexperienced, it might seem like you're in the worst possible place, but actually you're quite lucky, and your path to learning game may actually be easier than for other beginners for two specific reasons. Number one, because when you start, you're likely to make dramatic progress quickly, which means you're more likely to actually stick with game. Number two, because you don't have serious bad habits you need to unwire. And the key for you is to sort of zigzag towards your goal without actually incorporating bad habits along the way. In order to illustrate this, I'll give you the example of someone who started in that bottom quadrant, which is me. So I started as a sheltered kid in high school who didn't have very good social skills. So I was in that bottom quadrant. When I got to college, I came out of my shell and I started doing cold approach at the same time. So the balls of doing cold approach plus the social acumen I learned from starting to come out of my shell socially actually made me go in the ideal direction, diagonally upward on this grid at first, into the grid of being someone with decent social skills overall. Then I started learning formal game, and I actually got much more polarizing, but I got uncalibrated, and I went back into this other quadrant, which isn't so ideal, but I was getting net better at game. I was learning to be polarizing, I was learning to get attraction, but I was also becoming just slightly weird along the way. And I continued along that path for quite a while, until I actually got a little bit uncalibrated. Then what I had to do is I had to normalize, tone it down, and become more calibrated again. And my game actually got less powerful, but more consistent and controlled, and I developed better connection and got much better results overall, and much more consistent results, but I actually had a harder time opening the hottest girls. And then since then, I've been going back and forth, sort of zigzagging in this upper quadrant, getting closer and closer to an elite level. And that's what you should really do if you're coming from that bottom quadrant, is zigzag towards your goal. And honestly, that's what you should do in any quadrant, is you want to zigzag towards your goal. You're going to have periods of having to work on your social skills, and then that's going to become your dominant positive factor. You're going to have to work on your game. And then that becomes more powerful than your social skills, and you're going to go back. So you're going to keep zigzagging towards your eventual goal. But it's very important to understand where you're at, because if you zig when you should zag, you're actually going to get farther from the goal, and you're going to make things harder for yourself. And along the way, try and avoid going to the extreme, either in this direction or this direction. Avoid developing bad habits you're going to have to unwire later. It's good to have a path of balance. And if you're studying game and working on game and going out, it's nice to have some normal social outlets. If you have some normal social outlets, it's really good to incorporate some game and be a little more ballsy. You need to have that balance if you want your progress to be simple. You can obviously get there anyway, but it's a lot harder to go to extremes and come back than it is to zigzag and stay in the middle. And that's what I really recommend for any beginner or really anybody learning game.